The question we all have to ask is, how far does this go? Right? So the Carolina Hurricanes are in the playoffs. That starts in 4 hours' time from when I'm recording this. And it has been a huge party of fun. I've had fun with it along the way. There have been numerous videos released by Jillian Fisher. Excellent work by her on following and showing that the Carolina Hurricanes have a lot of fans. They're having a lot of fun right now. And really cutting into that stereotype about Carolina's attendance, fan base, all of that stuff. And it's good to see. We all want Quebec back. I think even Carolina fans would like to see Quebec back. Expansion can be your friend. Ask Vegas. Now, the interesting thing is I decided to put on the board every season Carolina's had up until the last time they won the Stanley Cup, which was the first time they won the Stanley Cup. 05-06, 52 wins, 22 losses, 8 overtime or shootout losses, 112 points. Peter Laviolette's their coach. They're first in the Southeast that year. But remember going into the playoffs, they were the one team that we looked at and said, well, they play in the Southeast, so that 112 points, how much of that comes from the fact they play Atlanta, they play Florida. Tampa was really bad at the time. Washington was supposed to be the only good team. They weren't the only good team that year. The division was kind of a disaster, and that was seen as the reason why Carolina was first place. If they were in a real division, they would have been third or fourth. If they were in a real division, they wouldn't be here. And then they win a Stanley Cup. The playoffs that year started with Martin Gerber. And very quickly, a couple games in, it turned into Cam Ward. So Gerber never quite got back to where he was as the starter for the Carolina Hurricanes. And Cam Ward would win that Stanley Cup, win a Conn Smythe, and he never really got to that level again either. So it was an interesting situation for them entering the 2016-2017 season, or 2006-2007 season. I will get my seasons right, I promise. 40 wins, 34 losses, 8 overtime losses, 88 points. Peter Laviolette still coach. They finished 4 points out of the playoffs. You know what's really interesting about Carolina is they're not generally a horrible team for this entire run. But they're remembered as being a horrible team because they missed the playoffs every year. 2007-2008, 43 wins, 33 losses, 6 overtime or shootout losses, 92 points. Peter Laviolette still the coach. They finish 2 points back of a playoff spot and 2 points behind first in the Southeast Division, occupied by, that's right, the Washington Capitals. So they were the two decent teams in that division, and everybody else kind of sucked at that point. 2008-2009, it's back to the playoffs time. They finished 45-30-7, 97 points. Laviolette is replaced early in the year by Paul Maurice. Maurice turns the team around. They finished second in the Southeast Division. They reached the conference finals that year. It's a good time to be a Carolina fan, right? They win a cup 3 years later. They're in the conference finals. This is a team that may very well be built to win. 2009-2010 season, they finished 35-37-10, 80 points. Paul Maurice still coached. They finished 8 points out of the playoffs. So it is a pretty large crash. 17 points off the year before, and that's kind of where the big crash happens. But they do bounce back. They finished the following season at 40-31-11, 91 points. Maurice coaches them within 2 points of the playoffs. They finished 2 points out. So again, if not for a couple of wins in these seasons, we wouldn't be talking about these gigantic periods of time where they don't make the playoffs. That being said, the following year, 2011-2012, they finished 33-16, 82 points. Paul Maurice is replaced by Kirk Muller. They finished 10 points out of the playoffs. I always felt bad for Kirk Muller. I always felt like the team just wasn't good enough, that Kirk Muller was a decent enough coach. That said, the following season, a lockout-shortened season, 19-25-4 is the record for 42 points. Kirk Muller, the coach, they finished 13 points out of the playoffs. Now, finishing 13 points out of the playoffs in a season that's only 48 games long, that's bad. And that is, for me, the worst season they have on this board. It is the worst season, and it's really a down point for them. And yet, they're not a team that had a number one draft pick along the way. 2013-2014, they finished at 36-35-11 for 83 points. Kirk Muller, still coach. They finished 10 points out of the playoffs. And I'm still pretty convinced that Kirk Muller's a decent coach, but they fire him. And he's out and Bill Peters is in. Now, it's interesting. Bill Peters right now, kind of a hero to the Calgary Flames. I don't know if you've heard, but the Flames had a decent season as well, as much as we talk about how Carolina making the playoffs has been a headline. The Flames being number one in the West has been a headline as well. Well, before Bill Peters is going to get there, he's going to have 4 years in Carolina. The first season, not entirely beneficial. 30, 41, and 11, 71 points. 17 points out of the playoffs. That is the farthest to finish out of the playoffs of any season on the board. That's an 82-game season. 13 points over a 48-game season projects to be worse. But 17 points is the worst one on the board. So for Bill Peters that first year, not a really abundantly great one. Following season, it gets a bit better. 35, 31, and 16, 86 points. 7 points out of the playoffs. And it is after that season that I say, hey guys, I think Carolina's gonna be good next year. Yeah. The following season they finished 36, 31, and 15 for 87 points. And coming out of that season, not only did I think they were going to be good, I figured playoffs. I was off by a year. I hope I can be forgiven for being off by a year. And the following season, they finished 36, 35, and 11 for 83 points. And it's an alarming holding pattern they're in, where these 3 seasons are 4 points separated, 1 win separated from one another. Bill Peters coaching, and they finished 14 points out last year. And that's when Tom Dundon said, that's enough. And this is why Ron Francis gets fired. And we can look back at things right now and say, hey, Francis wasn't a bad GM. And I said that at the time he was fired. But the track record is what it is. His track record as coach, Bill Peters in Carolina, it was spotty. Track record for general manager Ron Francis, a lot of good young players. It just didn't gel. It just didn't work. And the Scott Darling contract, likely a big part of the reason why Ron Francis was ousted as GM. He had a miserable season with Carolina, and so you change GMs. You bring in Don Waddell. And they bring in Don Waddell and Rod Brindamore as coach. And this season, they win. Which is odd for a team with Don Waddell as general manager. And I say that because if you look at historically, Waddell went to Atlanta, made some interesting moves, and that fell apart. Now, of course, the most interesting moves that were made were Jeff Skinner was traded for not enough. And even though now Skinner may move on from Buffalo, Carolina, that doesn't change the fact Carolina didn't get enough for him last summer. You can't look back and go, well, yeah, he had 40 goals for Buffalo, but he's not going to stay in Buffalo, so we made a really good move. No, that's not how any of that works. That'd be like me saying, well, yeah, we won the Marcus Naslund trade, but eventually went to the Rangers, so it was a saw-off between the Canucks and the Penguins. And then they made the trade where Lindholm and Hanifin are traded to Calgary in exchange for Ferland and Hamilton. I would argue that Ferland has not been as proficient up front as expected, nor does it make up for the loss of Lindholm. And Hamilton, offensively, I like him better than Hanifin, but I think Hanifin's really helped solidify that top 4 for Calgary. I think it was time for Hamilton to move on from Calgary. And so it's a trade that I would argue Carolina's lost. Now, they're trying to sign Adam Fox if they can. That trade may be more of a saw-off than it looks like right now. But that's the interesting thing. Carolina loses a couple of big trades, and they get better. They finished this season at 46, 29, and 7, 99 points. So what changed? Well, the coach changed. Brindamore brings in this really solid, responsible system. Their goaltending definitely changed. Both Mrazek and McElhinney, which were their starters, weren't their goaltenders last year. Mrazek was a cast-off from the Flyers after being cast off by the Red Wings. McElhinney was a waiver wire pickup from the Maple Leafs. And yeah, Carolina, the biggest talk with Carolina coming into the season was Scott Darling. Canes fans said he's been working out over the summer. He's going to be good. And when they picked up McElhinney, there were still some Canes fans that said, well, maybe this is because Mrazek isn't ready. And then the awkwardness started when Scott Darling was the one that got waived. It was kind of a brilliant move from Don Waddell. That he saw Darling isn't going to be good enough. And it is a huge part of the reason why this team ends up finishing in the playoffs. you can't just look at a contract and go, well, we've got to give this guy a shot because look how much money he's made. There's an argument that the Canucks have done that with Louis Eriksson to their detriment, that the Oilers have done that with Milan Lucic also to their detriment. And Carolina said, well, Scott Darling, bad contract, we're going to send it away. And, it was bright. Now, I know that there are players with no movement clauses, Milan Lucic included. We could talk about Chiarelli a whole other time, right? But they finished fourth in the Metro this year, and now they get Washington in the first round. And while I'm not taking them to beat Washington, it's been an impressive run for them. How sustainable is this? Do they end up falling back out of the playoffs? Well, 99 points is the highest point total they've had since 05-06, when they won the Stanley Cup. So this is the best season that Carolina's had outside of their best overall, that whole Cup victory thing 13 years ago. The interesting thing is looking over who they drafted in the first round. I'm not getting into all the other draft picks. But in the first round, so for teams that are outside the playoffs and for fans that are on the whole tank squad and you've got to get that number one draft pick, maybe it's just about developing the players you get no matter what round they're in. First draft pick the year they won the Stanley Cup was Jamie McBain at 63. Not a big deal. He doesn't end up being a star because he's a number 63 draft pick. The following year, they draft at number 11. They get Brandon Sutter. Brandon Sutter, of course, will be traded for Jordan Staal. Stahl's a pretty good player. Sutter, on the other hand, has moved on to Vancouver, injury prone, and he's never quite reached his offensive peak that was expected when he was drafted at 11. The following year, they draft Zach Boychuk. Does he follow you again on Twitter? Me too. He's drafted at 14 in 2008. You can congratulate him on that on Twitter if you'd like. And he had a middling career trying to get into the NHL, and he's gone on to have a decent hockey career. I know we all focus on whether or not a guy's in the National Hockey League being a star, but he's had a decent career for himself. That being said, he is not a key producer going forward for a team that hasn't had great results over the last 13 years. Number 27 in 2009, they draft Philippe Paradis. And that's as far as we can go with that. Because where's he? He ended up getting traded to Toronto, I believe. And then not much happened for him from there. 2010, they draft at 7th overall. They draft Jeff Skinner. Jeff Skinner, of course, now with Buffalo. And they got back not enough. 2011, they draft Ryan Murphy at 12th. Ryan Murphy didn't turn out to be an NHL-level defenseman. He gets moved out a couple years ago. 2012, at 38th overall, they draft Phil DiGiuseppe. He was waived this season. Ended up moving along. And currently, I believe he's in the American League. 2013, Elias Lindholm, drafted at number 5. He, of course, part of that trade to the Calgary Flames. 2014, at number 7, they draft Hayden Fleury. There are lots of rumors about Hayden Fleury potentially being traded during this season. There'll be rumors after this season and talks about whether or not he's going to get his first goal anytime soon. So I'll go ahead and say that number 7 pick, not a huge part of their run in 2019. 2015, they draft at number 5, Noah Hannafin, who was seen as a franchise-level defenseman at the time he's drafted. It's easy to forget that, too. There was a lot of hype around Hannafin, and never quite lived up to it with Carolina. He's a decent top 4 defenseman, though, and Calgary takes him in that trade, along with Lindholm. So 2 number 5s get moved to Calgary. Number 13 in 2016, Jake Bean. Still in their prospect system, isn't he? He's still in there somewhere, isn't he? Let's go ahead and see what Future Watch has to say about him. I just happen to have Future Watch sitting right here. Jake Bean, who is sitting as a number 42 overall. Bean may not end up being the top pair D-man the team envisioned when they drafted him, but he has still put up points at the American League level while improving his defensive play. He held his own in a two-game NHL edition. Bean needs to work on his agility, nimbleness, and skating ability in tight areas. Isn't that the same thing? Skating, nimbleness, and agility. That also sounds like skating. They could have just said, he needs to work on his skating. The nimbleness is just because they found that somewhere in a thesaurus. And somebody's like, hey, you can't get that in the article. Oh, yeah? Watch. Well played. So, yeah. And management would like to see more improvement in the defensive zone. If that happens and he continues his level of play, continues his level of play in other areas, he'll challenge for an NHL roster spot soon. So yeah, that's the Jake Bean story 3 years out from him being drafted. Still uncertain as to whether or not he's going to be a full-time NHLer. 2017 at 12 overall, they draft Martin Necas. Netscash, Necas, Necas. I don't really care. He's not in the NHL right now. He hasn't been a part of their rise to the playoffs, so it's really not important for this video. No, it's not. It isn't. 2018, number 2 overall, Andrei Svechnikov. Now, Svechnikov did have a 20-goal season this year. Got better as the season went along. Had slow points during the season. He did play a role in getting them here. Winning that draft lottery at number 2 definitely helped them. But without Svechnikov, I would argue they're still a playoff team. I don't know that they necessarily would have moved some of the guys. Maybe they don't move Skinner if they don't draft Svechnikov. Maybe that's how that works out. But Svechnikov has not been a huge part of this. What we have with Carolina is simple. You can get into the whole surge, the bunch of jerk stuff as much as you want. And if you get into that, that plays right into their wheelhouse. They love that. They love that people are complaining about them because people are talking about them. And as long as fans are talking about you, it's better than these other years when fans weren't. The only narrative with Carolina in between the Stanley Cup and this year, for the most part, the major narrative has been fans don't show up, the team's going nowhere, moving back to Hartford. Say people who forget Hartford didn't support them either. That's why they ended up in Carolina. They didn't have an arena, and there weren't enough fans when the arena was there. So, overall, it's been an excellent season for Carolina. 46 wins is the second highest total behind the 05-06 season when they won the Stanley Cup. And I'm telling you, they're dangerous. But even if they go out in the first round, I think we'll be seeing more of the Storm Surge next year. I think we'll see a lot more fans in that stadium next year. And I think the future is really bright for the Carolina franchise in general. And I didn't think that was the case a year ago when they were talking about cleaning house. And they did clean house. And yet, somehow, despite the fact they cleaned house and they didn't win very many trades, they did win the Nino Niederreiter trade, though, didn't they? The fact is, they're still a playoff team. Pretty excellent run. And congratulations to the Carolina Hurricanes for returning to the playoffs. Let's see if they come back next year. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. And hey, thank you guys so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon.